Триває 92-й день.
This is the 92nd day of Ukrainian resistance. We have Mediacentru Ukraine. We have Denis Marchuk with us, Deputy Chairman of Ukrainian Agrarian Council, and we'll discuss the status of the agricultural sector in Ukraine. Good day. Denis, our first question to you is how would you describe the status of the agricultural Ukrainian sector? The Ukrainian agrarian sector is holding the second front line in Ukraine, as we are fully aware that we shoulder the great responsibility before the armed forces of Ukraine, fighting our frontiers, defying the enemy, and we agrarians need to make sure that Ukrainian people and army have enough food to go around to be able to confront the enemy. To say it's easy today would not be right. The war is inevitably affecting our operation. The sowing campaign has been hampered, but we managed to perform better than expected, even though in the early days we thought the sowing areas would shrink much more significantly, but so far we are in a position to say that we have sown 75% of the arable land. All the regions have completed their spring sowing campaign. Some are completing some final fields, but this is indicative that the agrarians have coped with their mission, and we will have good performance of the spring crops. So in July we'll be reaping already the crops that can be put on the tables in Ukraine, that can be sold in Ukraine, and this is a way to assure our food security. Tell us, how will the agricultural market change in Ukraine? Will the areas shrink? Will the range of food sown be affected? Will the finished food stuffs be different? Will the export driven companies now cater to the domestic markets? What is bound to change? Well, you have rightly pointed out that the situation is bound to change, and for businesses to stay afloat, they need to adapt to the new realities. And the agrarian businesses are seeing that now we cannot export due to the seaports being blocked, and it used to convey the greatest exports through the Black Sea. So now we need to change gears and sell the crops that we produce in Ukraine. Some companies have changed their crop rotation. Some have sown more buckwheat and other crops. Some are now growing vegetables, as Kherson and Zaporizhia lands have been occupied, and we won't be able to produce some of the vegetable crops they had earlier delivered. And therefore now the central and western companies are filling in. This is a war, and yet it is a unique change to redefine ourselves and less produce the raw crops, but work to create added value. And now there'll be lending offers for the producers in order to create added values so that it can stay on in Ukraine, and also that we can export the products with greater added value. So we are now reconsidering. Some other companies are sowing a wider range of crops. We carry over more than 20 million cereal crops, and the silos are full. In a month and a half, we'll be collecting the winter harvest, and we'll need to store it accordingly. So when the winter crops are reaped, we don't want to keep too much sunflower or corn. So some are sowing soya instead, as it doesn't require such storage facilities. And now the agricultural companies are being flexible to accommodate the changing circumstances. How will the food basket change for the Ukrainians? Will we consume less vegetables? Will we have to do without some crops? I wouldn't say that we'll sense some catastrophic shortage of food, as most Ukrainian lands are liberated and free, and the agricultural companies are growing their crops, rearing livestock, milking cows. We have enough dairy to go around, and that will define what Ukrainians have on their tables in their shopping baskets. And I don't think nothing will change catastrophically. If we don't have, let's say, red caviar, as we won't import it into Ukraine, but otherwise, we should have enough food to go around. We should have enough vegetables too. Today, because of the occupation of the south of Ukraine, the companies can't harvest some vegetables there, but this will be taken over by the western, central, and northern regions. And when the open vegetables are produced, they'll be in greater numbers. We will also keep receiving the imports from Turkey. As we have before, we'll be importing vegetables from Poland. And the question is that hopefully people will be solvent and can afford the traditional food portfolio, as the war is hitting all of us and the price on a number of food commodities has gone up because the supply chains have been disrupted, because the fuel has gone up in price. The inflation is spiraling in Ukraine, and if a year ago we could buy the same product at a certain price, we'd have to pay 15-20% more compared to last year's. If you could give a piece of advice on the 3-5 specific steps that need to be made to improve the standing of agriculture in Ukraine, what would the steps be? What would you recommend? Well, the Agrarian Committee and the Ministry of Agriculture have top-class professionals. As the Ukrainian Agrarian Council, we help shape the agrarian policy in Ukraine. And our number one priority these days is to open export, and this is addressed by the Minister of Agriculture and the President of Ukraine. When he reaches out to the world, he urges the world to help us unblock our exports, and that is important because we have enough food for our domestic consumption, but the other countries might suffer, and there's a looming threat of famine in North Africa and Asian countries. So we need to reap our export potential. We need to open our Black Sea ports. And then we need to prepare for the harvest campaign. And for the harvest campaign, all of us will need support coming from the government, from our international partners, so that the companies would have the fuel and lubricants and sufficient supply. We still had our reserves for the spring sowing campaign, but we are running dry on those inputs, and this is what needs the intervention of the government, business, and our international partners. How we do maintain our traditional foreign markets as we cease exporting our produce, and the companies will still need to uh, meet the demands, perhaps looking for less risky options. It's not easy for them to replace the Ukrainian commodities, as we had supplied a lot of grain, a lot of wheat, uh, contributing 20% of world grain exports. If we talk about processed sunflower seed and oil, we comprised 50% of the global supply, and it won't be able to replace Ukraine in a short time perspective. We all need to think hard the way we could bring in more media, political, and international leverage to force Russia to unblock our ports. And if we open our ports, we don't need to think who needs our export. The world will always need Ukrainian agricultural commodities. As we are export-driven company, we grow much more than we consume. That's one point to make. Secondly, now we've seen facilitated terms of cooperation with the EU. It is a colossal market with 500 million people who are wealthy too. And now that the custom duties and quotas have been lifted on agricultural commodities, we need to make ample use of that opportunity to win over the European consumers, to enter the European supermarkets, to offer high quality produce at affordable prices. And that is a wonderful opportunity for us to produce more added value produce to meet that demand. Thank you very much for your answers. We talked to Denis Marchuk, Deputy Chairman of Ukrainian Agrarian Council. We discussed the status of the agricultural sector in Ukraine. We'll continue.